Merriam-Webster defines nationalism as loyalty and devotion to a nation. We'll start our discussion about nationalism with a pushback against nationalism. In the early 1800s, on the heels of the French Revolution, Napoleon Bonaparte conquered mainland Europe. After his misstep of invading Russia resulted in Napoleon's rapid fall from power, the leaders in Europe met and created the Concert of Europe to 1. Maintain the balance of power between the European powers, and 2. Stop the nationalistic uprisings within the European empires. They would even go so far as helping one another put down these uprisings, even though they would not be able to count one another among their friends. The Concert of Europe prevented more wars within Europe for the first half of the 1800s, and was impactful in preventing many revolutions from being successful in 1848. This Concert of Europe broke down when Russia attempted to take what is now Romania in Eastern Europe from the Ottoman Empire in 1853. While they thought the European powers would support the attack on the Ottomans, the British and French viewed the attempted expansion of Russia into Europe as a threat to the balance of power that stood in Europe. To the surprise of the Russians, the British and the French joined the side of the Ottomans, thus turning the war into a war between the European powers. The Crimean War foreshadowed some of the brutal problems present in World War I, particularly when it came to old tactics being used with new weapons to the death of many soldiers. When the conflict in Crimea was over, the Concert of Europe was broken, opening the door to future nationalistic efforts in Europe. Two major examples of these nationalistic efforts were in Italy and Germany. Italy officially became a nation in 1848 with the creation of the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. After the Crimean War ended, Victor Emmanuel was able to get favorable terms for his country over their dispute against Austria for land in the north of modern Italy, because the Italians had sent troops to fight alongside the British and French in the Crimean War. Over the course of the next 2 decades, they were able to add each of the independent states in the Italian peninsula to one unified nation, achieving complete unification of Italy in 1871. For Germany, the last of the Holy Roman Empire had broken up in 1806. Of the remaining independent German states, Prussia was the strongest and was one of the major European powers throughout the 1800s. In the 1860s, the Prussian leader Wilhelm I and his Prime Minister Otto von Bismarck began a campaign to unify Germany. Using a philosophy of blood and iron, with a strong emphasis on military strength, the Prussians fought successive wars with dominating victories over Denmark, Austria, and France. These wars fanned nationalistic pride throughout the German states, and the Prussians used these wars to draw the remaining German states to their cause and country. Germany was officially unified as an empire in the Versailles Palace in France in 1871. Once unified, Germany was the unquestioned, dominant, land-based military power in Europe. European powers had competing national pride and often attempted to show their superiority to the competing European nations. The other causes that will be discussed later in this series were partially motivated by nationalistic goals. Austria was an empire in Europe that contained multiple ethnic groups, many who wanted independence and to break away from the empire. Austria turned their empire into a dual monarchy with the Hungarians to maintain peace within their empire. But other groups wanted autonomy and independence in Austria. Particularly, the Slavic people in Bosnia, which were under Austrian rule, wanted to combine with their Slavic brethren in Serbia into one Slavic nation. This group exhibited national pride in their expectation and freedom in a hoped-for future country of their own. Nationalistic fervor was in full swing in the years leading up to World War I. By the time the war began, the powder keg of nationalism in the Balkans was ready to spark a wildfire. Merriam-Webster defines imperialism as the policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, especially by direct territorial acquisitions or by gaining indirect control over the political or economic life of other areas. In other words, a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. The concept of European empire building was nothing new. The Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire, and colonization of the Americas all happened long before the 1900s. Africa and Asia, on the other hand, came under the gaze of the Europeans. In the early 1840s, Great Britain used the Opium War to open up China to trade with the Europeans. Japan was opened for trade by an agreement with American Commodore Matthew Perry in 1853. Africa as a continent had largely been left alone by the Europeans prior to the late 1800s, but the inventions of the Maxim gun, an early machine gun, and quinine to treat malaria lowered the European human cost to expand their empires into Africa. And the writings of David Livingstone chronicled the interior of the continent, which had been avoided by Europeans. Indeed, King Leopold of Belgium read Livingstone's writings and decided to colonize the Congo. The European powers, with the prompting of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, met at the Berlin Conference in 1884 to discuss European colonization of Africa. An agreement between these powers was signed in 1885. The European powers would need to inform one another of their intent to conquer and hold particular territory in Africa, but the Africans themselves were left out of the discussion. King Leopold of Belgium successfully conquered Congo in 1885, making it the first African colony, but it began a descent of European nations upon the African continent. By the early 1900s, all of Africa except Ethiopia and Liberia were colonized. The Italians had tried and failed to conquer Ethiopia at the Battle of Adwa, and Liberia was a fairly new independent nation that was created in 1821 by free people of color in the U.S. through the American Colonization Society and became independent in 1847, so the Europeans left that country alone. In the Western Hemisphere, American overseas imperialism had been present as early as the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, when the United States declared that European powers were not welcome to create new colonies in the Americas. The concept of manifest destiny, that the U.S. was destined to control the land from the Atlantic to the Pacific Oceans, was created in 1845. After agreeing to a treaty with Great Britain for the border between modern-day Canada and what is now the states of Washington and Oregon, the U.S. fought a war with Mexico from 1846 to 1848. By defeating Mexico in this war, the U.S. gained territory from Texas to California and what is today the 48 contiguous states. The U.S. bought Alaska from Russia in 1867, but the next big imperialism push in the United States was the Spanish-American War in 1898. While the Europeans were focused on conquering Africa, the U.S. fought for Cuba to become independent from Spain. In the process, the U.S. also used a modern fleet to defeat Spain's antiquated navy at the Philippines and annexing Hawaii in the process. And when the dust had settled, the Treaty of Paris that ended the Spanish-American War gave Cuba independence, and the U.S. gained Puerto Rico and Guam, purchased the Philippines, and gained a plot of land on Cuba at Guantanamo Bay. The U.S. was instrumental in the independence of Panama from Colombia in 1903, and the U.S. gained the use of the land that would become the Panama Canal, which was completed in 1914. The renewed effort toward imperialism in the late 1800s had nationalistic and militaristic goals, but the other motivations were industrialization and the humanitarian goals of the Europeans and Americans. Industrialization required resources, markets to sell finished goods, and the ability to transport those goods to the market. Imperialism offered a way for the Europeans and Americans to make that happen. Humanitarian efforts had different motivations. For some, the motivation was to spread their Christian faith to people who did not have it. For others, the motivation was to civilize the subjugated people. Education, particularly literacy, updated infrastructure, modern medicine, and new technology were brought to the conquered territories. While these advances clearly included many benefits for the colonized people groups, the use of social Darwinism as the justification for subjugation of people groups was a driving force behind many of the empire-building efforts. Social Darwinism was built on the evolutionary concepts of Charles Darwin, which stated that the strong survive and evolve and the weak fail. This was applied to culture in the late 1800s by stating that some countries, ethnicities, and groups were superior to others. Civilizing people groups meant that a value judgment was made that the group was uncivilized, and the colonizers believed that they had a superior culture. While these ideas have not held up to the test of time, they were embraced during the period of imperialism. By 1914, much of the world was under the control or influence of one or more of the major empires. The imperial aspirations of the European powers were butting up against one another, and the desire to expand would cause the conflict between these nations. Militarism is defined as a policy of aggressive military preparedness. With the failure of the concert of Europe after the Crimean War in 1853, a period of relative peace between the European powers ended. With the blood and iron tactics of military conquest used by the Germans to defeat Denmark, Austria, and France with ease between 1864 and 1871, the other European nations saw the threat posed by the Germans and earnestly prepared for the potential for conflict. While European nations had spread their influence and might around the world through imperialism, their grand power as individual countries made them fearful of one another, further driving military expansion to match their opponents in military strength. Germany maintained a culture of military preparedness that allowed them to keep their military vibrant and prepared for a breakout of war in 1914. The German military was large, structured, and efficient in its preparation of soldiers to fight for their country. Concerns about Russia also kept the Germans diligent. France, chastened by its defeat at the hands of the Germans in 1871, built the Maginot Line, fortresses all along the border of France and Germany in preparation for another German assault. The French built up their military strength and leveraged an expanding empire to prepare themselves in case war with the Germans arose again. The Russians realized they were behind the other Europeans after the disaster of a conflict that was the Crimean War in 1853. They put great effort into improving their military and catching up to the other nations. Their efforts were slowed by attempted uprisings against the Tsar throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, as well as an embarrassing short war against the Japanese where Russia sailed its European navy to Asia only to have it destroyed by the more modern Japanese fleet. Great Britain did not expand their conventional military in the same way as their continental European neighbors did. Instead, the British updated and expanded their naval power to protect the British Isles, but also as a practical measure to protect the waterways that were necessary to maintain their expanded worldwide empire. Austria had a complex military setup due to its dual monarchy. The country had what was called a tripartite army, including the Austrian army, Hungarian army, and a third royal army that was a general army for the entire empire. This created potential complications for efficient distribution of military resources when war would break out later. Unrest within the borders of the empire and disputes over land on the western reaches of the empire with Italy made it necessary to prepare for a conflict in which Austria would eventually become one of the first movers in the chessboard of Europe. The leadership in the Ottoman Empire was taken over by the Young Turks in the early 1900s. Included in many reforms was an attempt to westernize and revitalize the Ottoman military. The Ottoman Empire was viewed as the sick man of Europe by many other European powers, and the Ottomans had been slowly pushed out of Europe since they had been defeated at the Battle of Vienna in 1683. Their attempt to prepare their military for battle was an attempt to re-establish their legitimacy as a major player in European politics. The United States had built a state-of-the-art navy in the late 1800s and early 1900s. While Theodore Roosevelt had used the Great White Fleet to project American power around the world, the United States did not expend the same effort and focus in the early 1900s preparing the United States for war. Instead, the progressive era brought many domestic reforms in the United States, including politics, business, and the creation of the national parks. Additionally, there was greater focus on what was happening in Latin America, particularly in Panama, where the United States spent years trying to crack the code of how they would build the Panama Canal before finally finishing in 1914. The American industrial sector had immense capacity in the early 1900s, but it was not being used to develop a war machine in the United States prior to World War I. Europe was at a high level of military readiness in the years leading up to World War I. The tension created by the military buildup created distrust between the major powers in Europe. With distrust came negative assumptions about neighbors, and finally a willingness to enter war quickly against their opponents. Little did they know that this military preparation would make for a great defensive war, but would lead to horrifying results on the battlefield in terms of human life and the style of fighting that was required to fight in this war. An alliance is defined as a formal agreement or treaty between two or more nations to cooperate for specific purposes. The first alliance in the years leading up to World War I was between France and Russia in 1894. Both countries feared Germany's military strength, especially since Germany had shown a willingness to attack its neighboring countries in 1871. Germany responded by creating its own alliance with Austria-Hungary. Great Britain desired to keep the balance of power in Europe intact, so it set aside rivalries with France and Russia to join them to form the Triple Entente. The Italians would join Germany and Austria to form the Triple Alliance. Tension was great in the Balkans region. The Austrians had an antagonistic relationship with Serbia over the movement to join the Slavic nations in the Balkans into a unified nation. Bosnia, which was part of the Austrian Empire, was part of the region that Serbia wanted to annex. Russia supported its Slavic neighbors in their movement for independence and unification, which created hostility between Russia and Austria-Hungary. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, visited Sarajevo in Bosnia. He wanted to build connections with the various people groups within his empire, which was a very different approach than the leader of Austria, Franz Joseph. What Franz Ferdinand did not understand was the extent to which the separatist movement was present in Bosnia, particularly Sarajevo. The Black Hand, an organization that actively worked to unify Bosnia with Serbia, had members that saw this visit as an opportunity to assassinate the Archduke and hatched their plan. When Ferdinand arrived in Sarajevo, he drove in his open-top car along the river in Sarajevo and was greeted by huge crowds. Members of the Hand were spread throughout the crowd. They were equipped with bombs and would try to blow up the Archduke's car. When Ferdinand's procession of cars drove by the would-be assailants, an attacker named Kabrinovich threw his bomb. The driver recognized what the object was and accelerated. The aim of Kabrinovich was true, but Ferdinand deflected the bomb and it exploded behind the car. Ferdinand's car was not damaged, but a dozen spectators were injured. The driver sped away to safety at City Hall. Ferdinand continued the planned event. After the event ended, Ferdinand wanted to visit those who had been hurt in the explosion. The route to the hospital would take them back along the same path that the attack had been committed only hours earlier. Gavrilo Princip was one of the would-be assassins from the bombing attack. Since the attempt had failed, Princip had walked away to Morris Schiller's Delicatessen on Franz Joseph Street. Archduke Ferdinand's change of plans were not communicated to his driver or the mayor of Sarajevo. The mayor continued to the original museum destination, and Ferdinand's driver turned onto Franz Joseph Street. The hospital was farther down the main road, so the driver would need to turn around or back up. He slowed the car to a stop, right in front of Moritz Schiller's Delicatessen. Princip didn't hesitate. He realized he got a second attempt to accomplish his original goal. His failure could be a success. He ran over to the Archduke's car and fired 2 shots, killing both the Archduke and his wife Sophie. Little did he realize that this moment would spark a powder keg into a wildfire. Austria-Hungary demanded that Serbia give up members of the Black Hand to be put on trial. When Serbia refused to cooperate, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914, 1 month after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. In support of Serbia, Russia had sent a warning to Austria-Hungary not to attack Serbia. Russia began to mobilize troops on the border of Austria-Hungary. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia in support of Austria-Hungary. The Germans were concerned about fighting a two-front war, but fighting France and Russia at the same time would be easier on Germany's terms. The Germans had planned in advance for the two-front war with the Schlieffen Plan. Under the Schlieffen Plan, the Germans would attack France and try to overwhelm and defeat France quickly, just as they had done in 1871. They would take their army to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians, who would take longer to mobilize their forces. The German plan would require the Germans to account for the fact that the French had built defensive fortresses all along their border with Germany, so the Germans planned to go around the fortresses through Belgium, since the French fortresses did not extend to their border with Belgium. The Germans declared war on France on August 3rd and immediately began marching troops through Belgium to reach France. The British demanded that the Germans withdraw from Belgium, defending Belgium's neutrality and independence. When the Germans ignored Great Britain and continued their march through Belgium toward France, Great Britain declared war on Germany on August 4th. Austria officially declared war on Russia on August 6th. France, Britain, and Russia would be called the Allies. Germany and Austria-Hungary were the Central Powers. The United States stayed neutral in Europe's war. Japan declared war on Germany, fighting Germany in the German colonies in Asia. Though Italy was allied with the Germans and Austrians, they declared that they would be neutral in the war. Their border disputes with the Austrians were still a barrier between the two nations, and Franz Joseph refused to concede any land to the Italians to induce Italy to join the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire, watching from a distance, saw an opportunity to reclaim lost territory and respect. They made the calculated decision to join the Central Powers, believing Germany was in a strong position to claim victory in the conflict. Within weeks, most of the world was at war. The next 4 years would encompass the deadliest and most grisly fighting the world had ever seen. When the fighting began in World War I, each major country was confident that the war would be quick and decisive. They had prepared to fight this war with overwhelming force. They did not account for the fact that the deadly technology that had allowed these nations to thrive in conflicts against other regions of the world would create a defensive stalemate of destruction. The German army invaded France quickly and was able to get within 50 miles of the capital of Paris, but the French were able to find a foothold, and once they fortified their front line, it became virtually impossible to move forward. Both sides figured out very quickly that digging trenches was the best way to respond to the machine guns and artillery that were being strayed across the battlefield. Instead of their troops being above ground or at risk of being hit by stray bullets and shrapnel from explosives, by digging trenches, they would be able to have a much higher level of safety. Additionally, barbed wire could be placed in front of the trench to slow down an opponent who did risk attacking, slowing them down and making them easier to hit. Both sides used this strategy, which created a stalemate. Since they did not want their opponents to take ground and push forward, both sides put mines throughout a strip of land between the trenches. The high risk of entering this area made soldiers call it no man's land. Years of fighting in France yielded negligible gains on both sides of the conflict. Early in the war, many battles were fought where generals used old tactics to try to overwhelm their opponents by sending their troops over the top of the trench and through no man's land, only to see their troops wiped out by the defensive emplacements built by their enemies. Many men were injured and killed due to this combination of tactics and destructive weaponry. As the war went on, both sides realized that something would need to change if the war were to progress differently. We will discuss the dynamics of different countries entering and exiting the war and how those impacted the conflict in other videos, but the introduction of new technology also changed the face of the war. Submarines, known at the time as U-boats or underwater boats, changed the nature of naval warfare. Prior to World War I, Great Britain had been the unquestioned naval power of Europe. Germany countered that strength with a new technology, the submarine. Though the submarine did not have the might and power of a battleship and would be utterly destroyed in a surface battle, it had stealth on its side. It could sneak past the British Navy undetected and do sneak attacks against the British Navy as well as supply ships. Subs would not allow Germany to have the strength to invade the UK, but they would allow the Germans to disrupt the war effort in France. As Great Britain became desperate to move supplies, they began arming civilian ships and moving supplies on those civilian ships. By early 1915, Germany implemented a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, where the U-boats would be allowed to sink both military and civilian vessels without warning. The Lusitania was a British passenger liner that had many Americans on board. The Germans sunk the Lusitania in May of 1915, which drew the ire of the United States. Germany, not wanting to draw the Americans into the war on the side of the Allies, paused the policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. December 17, 1903 was the first successful flight of a powered heavier-than-air aircraft by Orville Wright. World War I cemented their usefulness in conflicts. The first area they were useful was reconnaissance. A person flying in an airplane was able to see where the enemy's troops were located, as well as other troop movement. They could even take cameras into the air to take pictures of the battlefield to allow the commanders of the armies to make more informed decisions. As the war went on, technology was developed that allowed machine guns to be mounted on the front of planes and to only shoot when they would not hit the spinning blades. This allowed the new fighter airplanes to shoot down the reconnaissance planes. Once both sides had developed this technology, the fighter planes were sent to protect reconnaissance planes, and when fighter planes from both sides met in the sky, the first age of dogfighting was born, with pilots such as the Red Baron becoming famous for their skills at flying and shooting down enemy planes. In April of 1915, Germany tried to break the stalemate on the front lines by deploying gas on the battlefield, trying to throw off the Allies and create gaps in the line with chlorine gas, which would cause soldiers to choke and could even kill. Over the course of the war, gas masks were developed to defend against the use of these chemical weapons, and the Germans and Allies developed many harmful and lethal gases that were deployed on the battlefield. These gases did not have a significant impact on the outcome of the war, but the introduction of these gases ushered in an age of chemical warfare, and the choice to develop weapons that could cause mass destruction on a small scale began an escalation of the use and development of even stronger chemical weapons, bombs, and eventually nuclear weapons. And even though the chemical weapons did not single-handedly change the outcome of the war, they greatly impacted the lives of the million people who were casualties of these weapons, including the over 90,000 people who died from these weapons. Tanks were a brand new invention during World War I. They were born out of necessity when the machine gun decimated troops from both sides who would attack the front line. The first tanks were not effective. They overheated, broke down easily, and would get stuck in the mud. It took years of ineffective usage of tanks before the Renault FT was developed, deployed, and used effectively in 1918 to neutralize the German infantry. Within months after the FT tank was deployed on the battlefield, the Armistice would end the fighting on November 11, 1918. Trench warfare and military technology changed the face of warfare during World War I, setting the stage for an unprecedented century of military development and expansion worldwide. Though the fighting stopped in November of 1918, achieving peace would be a complex task, which would play out in the Versailles Palace in 1919. The dynamics of World War I were ever-changing. Even though there was a stalemate on the battlefield, different groups jumped into and out of the war throughout the 4 years that the fighting occurred. This video will discuss Italy, the Arab Revolt, and the entry of the United States into World War I. Another video, which will be linked in the description, will go over the Russian Revolution. Italy was part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria before World War I began. After war broke out, Italy wanted guarantees that they would be able to gain disputed land on their northeastern border with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Austria was not willing to support that proposal, and Italy did not immediately join when war broke out in 1914. Instead, they stayed on the sidelines for almost a year, waiting to hear from both sides whether they would receive an offer from either side for the things that they wanted. Finally, in April of 1915, the Allies agreed to allow the Italians to annex the land on their border with Austria in exchange for Italy joining the Allies in the fight against the Central Powers. Italy officially left the Triple Alliance and joined the Allies. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Germans because they believed Germany was in a stronger position to win the war, and the Ottoman Empire could regain land in Europe that was lost in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Ottoman Empire began with a campaign to take Egypt from the British. The campaign failed miserably. The Ottomans lost many troops, realizing that the British were in much stronger position and turning the war into a defensive war for the Ottomans. The British, in a stronger position, wanted to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and support the Russians with supplies in the same campaign. Under the leadership of British Secretary of the Navy Winston Churchill, a large naval force would move through the Dardanelles Strait and go directly to Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. After overwhelming the Ottomans and forcing them to surrender, the British would control the waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea and the Black Sea. Once this waterway was open, they could send supplies to the Russians and support the Eastern Front against the Germans. To gain control of the Dardanelles Strait, the British would have to send their ships through defenses that included fortresses, sea mines, and other treacherous conditions. Churchill's plan included an invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula on the west side of the strait, relieving some of the pressure of those defenses and allowing the ships to get through. While the end game of the strategy had tactical merit in the big picture of the war, the implementation was an utter disaster for the British, with 250,000 casualties and 46,000 dead. While the Ottomans had a significant amount of casualties as well, the defenses of the Ottoman Empire held, and the British were turned back. After the attack ended in that disaster, Winston Churchill was relieved of his post as the Secretary of the Navy and would take entering the army and fighting on the battlefield for the remainder of the war for him to start to rebuild his reputation after Gallipoli. The British did not want to divert more resources toward the Middle East. They needed to focus their effort on the Western Front against Germany. They were fortunate that an unlikely alliance was forged in the Middle East. The Arabs had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years. They offered to fight for the British if the British would commit to the Arabs gaining an independent state after World War I was over. The British agreed, and the Allies gained a new fighting force in the Middle East. To maintain communications and a common goal, the British sent T.E. Lawrence to be a liaison to the Arabs and coordinate their efforts. Lawrence had studied Arab culture and lived in the Middle East as he worked at excavation sites. The Arabs coordinated with the British via Lawrence, and the two armies were able to execute a two-pronged attack against the Ottomans, with the Arabs attacking the railway lines to stop Ottoman troop and supply movements, and the British attacking targets near the Mediterranean Sea. Both armies moved north and eventually met in Damascus. The taking of the city was the end of the campaign, and the Ottomans were left with a fraction of their pre-1914 empire. The United States was committed to isolationism in 1914. The U.S. did not want to get involved in Europe's war. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915 put tension between the United States and the Germans. This would start the United States on a trajectory toward war, though the U.S. would not enter until 2 years later. When the Russians dropped out of the war, the Germans gained an advantage by being able to send troops who had been fighting Russia on the Western Front to strengthen the fight against the Allies in France. While the Germans gained a tactical advantage by not having to fight a two-front war, the United States was more supportive of France and Great Britain in the outcome of the war. The Germans paused unrestricted submarine warfare after the sinking of the Lusitania, but they believed they could defeat the British quickly if they resumed the attacks, which further pushed the United States towards the Allies. Germany knew that the U.S. would not like the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and the final straw came with the Zimmermann telegram. The Germans believed that the United States would eventually enter the war on the side of the Allies, so they sent an encoded telegram to Mexico proposing an alliance against the United States if the U.S. entered the war against the Germans. Germany offered to give Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to the Mexicans as an incentive to join. The message was encoded, but the British were able to intercept the message and decode it. They shared it with the United States, and when the American people learned what the Germans had done, sentiment changed from anti-war to pro-war almost overnight. Just over a month after the American people learned about the Zimmermann telegram, the U.S. Congress voted for the United States to enter the war. The U.S. entry into the war was a boost to the Allies. Britain and France were weary after years of fighting, and the Germans had gained reinforcements on the Eastern Front. The injection of a new, fresh army into the war in late 1917 deflated the German morale. The American deployment, in conjunction with the introduction of effective tanks like the Renault FT in 1918, broke the stalemate. Slowly but surely, the Allies were able to push the Germans back throughout 1819 before the Armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. The troubles in Russia did not begin in the 1900s. Tsar Alexander Romanov was assassinated in 1881. His son Alexander III took over, and the family withdrew from public life. His son Nicholas II did not build a connection to his people, nor did he understand their concerns. Unrest continued in the country, and when Nicholas took over as Tsar, his response to public displays of unrest was to put down those displays with the military. There was an attempted revolution in 1905, and while the Tsar created the Duma, a representative legislative body, his promise of a legislative process that gave the Duma a high level of prominence did not become a reality. Tsar Nicholas did not continue with the reforms to his rule, and the tensions grew in the years leading up to 1914. When the war broke out, Nicholas focused his time and effort, as well as the country's resources, in defeating the Germans. While the Russians made some initial gains at the outbreak of the war in 1914, as the Germans focused their efforts on France, the Germans pushed back those advances and began pushing into Russia. Morale fell over time, and the focus of production on military equipment and supplies meant that things needed and desired by the people, namely food, were not being produced in large enough quantities, and the unrest became protest and movement toward revolution in early 1917. Unlike 1905, when the military strength stopped the revolution, in 1917, much of the military strength was focused on the battlefield, and military support for the Tsar had waned, and the unrest grew and became greater and greater. The Tsar dissolved the Duma since it was a center of challenges to his authority, but that just made the problem worse. The Tsar was focused on the war and was near the front lines with the troops, but ultimately chose to return to focus on the unrest. Instead of resolving the issue, however, he realized the extent of the unrest and ultimately abdicated from the throne. For the first time in 300 years, the Russian people were not ruled by a Romanov Tsar. The first attempt at a post-Tsarist government was the provisional government under the leadership of Alexander Kerensky. Instead of exiting World War I to focus on Russia's needs, the provisional government chose to continue fighting. This proved to be a critical decision for the fledgling government. Vladimir Lenin was a Bolshevik leader who had been in exile for 10 years prior to the abdication of the Tsar. With the winds of change blowing through Russia, Lenin decided to go home from Switzerland. Germany was happy to oblige, paying for his trip through Germany on a train to inject him back into Russian society and disrupt the Russian government. Lenin's presence redirected the direction of the Russian Revolution. He drew people toward the Bolshevik movement with promises of bread, peace, and land, and solidified power with the October Revolution, seizing power for the Bolsheviks. Russia pulled out of World War I, but the fighting did not end there. The Bolsheviks had many enemies in Russia, and the Bolshevik Red Army fought the White Armies of various leaders and warlords. The White Armies had the support of the United States, Great Britain, France, and Japan. Tsar Nicholas's family, which was being held by the Bolsheviks, was killed by the Bolsheviks in July of 1918. The counter-revolutionary movement to restore Tsar Nicholas to the throne would not achieve its goal. The fighting of World War I stopped in 1918, but the Russian Civil War continued for 3 more years. Ultimately, the Bolsheviks prevailed, and the Communist Soviet Union was born. The fighting in World War I stopped on November 11, 1918, but the war was not over. The Allied leaders met in the Versailles Palace starting in January of 1919 to hash out terms for the peace treaty. The location chosen was intentional, as the Germans had embarrassed the French decades before and forced the French to sign a peace treaty in Versailles, ceding power over to the Germans, and the French wanted to do the same. The Allied leaders came with different priorities. The French wanted to punish the Germans, the Americans wanted to have peace without punishment, and the British had a middle ground where they wanted to have their damages rectified from the war but did not want to go further in punishing the Germans beyond that. Ultimately, the Allied leaders were able to come to an agreement, and on June 28th of 1919, the Treaty of Versailles was finished. So what were the terms of this treaty that would have worldwide impact? First, all of the Central Powers were broken up. Germany lost colonies around the world. The nation of Poland was created using some German land, and France gained land from Germany. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken up into many smaller nations. Serbia and Bosnia, which had been ground zero for conflict before World War I, were combined with other Slavic countries in the region to create a country that would be known as Yugoslavia, which means the land of the South Slavs. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled, and during the 1920s, what remained of the Ottoman Empire became the nation of Turkey. The land that had been promised to the Arabs was divided between the French and the British as mandates, based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement and finalized with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The choice to keep the Middle Eastern lands as mandates became a point of tension between the West and the Middle East. The Russian Revolution resulted in the formation of the Soviet Union, and the Treaty of Versailles also pushed the former border of the Russian Empire further east as new countries were formed in Eastern Europe. Germany was blamed for the war and was required to pay reparations for the damage from the war. Germany's government transformed from an empire with an emperor to a republic with elected leadership. The League of Nations, an organization that was tasked with maintaining peace within Europe, was created by the Treaty of Versailles, but the United States did not join the organization and retreated back into isolation after World War I ended. Italy had joined the Allies based on an agreement made with the British, but they did not get everything they were promised after World War I. The disconnect between what the people of Italy were told, that Italy was joining the war to make gains for the country of Italy, and the result, Italy did not get all the gains they were promised, was one of the factors that would create tension between the Italians and King Victor Emmanuel. Japan was present at the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles after fighting alongside the Allies in Asia, but they did not have much to say in the outcome of the Treaty of Versailles. Their actions over the next 20 years would reflect a split with the Europeans on a path forward. World War I was devastating. The war to end all wars, it was called. Millions died as old tactics met new weapons technology. The fighting seemed hopeless and desolate for the soldiers who participated in the fighting on the ground. The structures of power in the world were realigned, and many countries were sharply set on new paths after the war. Little did they know at the time that the peace achieved at the Treaty of Versailles would be a temporary peace. Economic weakness hit some countries in the 1920s, and the Great Depression was in full swing around the world by the early 1930s, setting the stage for World War II.